If you can handle it, I'm going to get nostalgic for a little minute because I saw Tim and Uda and Terry and Lynn coming across the lake in their boats, and that reminded me of my childhood. My parents bought a cottage just down the lake here back in 1970, and then we ended up moving up from Etobicoke in 1971, and I spent most of my childhood on this lake. And I remember there were 4 weeks in the summer where family camp was at Joy Camp, where we got to come to church here on Sundays instead of having to go into town and do that. So we would come to church by boat, and that was pretty cool to see people coming by boat to come to church this morning. And just as I'm sitting there thinking about that. Hey, by the way, if you're sitting in the sun, you need a bit of shade, just come in here. You won't distract me. Don't worry about it. Or maybe you will, but don't worry about it. So if you can picture this, I can remember coming across the lake in our 1974 Larson with a 70-horse Johnson on it, and we would come and we would park at the end of the dock, and we were usually like 5-10 minutes late. It's kind of a Martin thing. And we would come in all our 1970s fashion. So as I recall, there are pictures of what my sister was wearing, and you can imagine the colors. And I think I had a brown polyester leisure suit. And I think we would all get dressed up, come across in the boat, come to church, and it was always exciting to come here. And I have some incredible memories just of being on this lake. Greg and James Maxwell lived in the cottage next to us, and I remember Connie and the Brunson crew. I can still picture his boat coming across the lake and coming to camp as well. And this lake just has a lot of memories. So I don't know if that taints my perspective of this lake, but I think this is an absolutely beautiful place to have church. And I think we need to, if you see anybody from the camp here, thank them for letting us come and do this. In the middle of a pandemic, we get to gather, and we get to gather in a place like this, which is pretty cool. So, that's not really what I'm up here to talk about, but that's what I'm talking about. We've been in this series called Become, and we start off every week by reading through this passage that talks about, it's James writing down about his spiritual growth and the steps that were in that. So let's just read through that passage and then we'll comment on it. Most of you can't see this. It's in 1 Peter chapter 1, starting at verse 4. Through these he has given us his very great and precious promise. Now, if you haven't gone to your Bibles and you've looked at what verse 3 is, you probably go through these. What are these? What are you talking about when it's talking about these? Well, verse 3 says this: His divine power has given us everything we need for a godly life through our knowledge of him who called us by his own glory and goodness. And so it starts off with, by his own glory and goodness, he has given us his very great and precious promise, so that through them, his glory and goodness, you may participate in the divine nature, having escaped the corruption of the world caused by evil desires. For this very reason, make every effort to add to your faith goodness, and to goodness knowledge, and to knowledge self-control, and to self-control perseverance, and to perseverance godliness, and to godliness mutual affection, and to mutual affection love. For if we possess these qualities in increasing measure, they will keep you from being ineffective and unproductive in your knowledge of the Lord Jesus Christ. But whoever does not have them is nearsighted and blind, forgetting that they have been cleansed from their past sins. We jump back to verse 5, and it says, for this very reason, make every effort to add to your faith. And then what I love about this passage is that it's very systematic. The way that Peter says you're supposed to grow your faith, he doesn't say, so add to your faith love. He starts with goodness. And goodness has no prerequisite. You can go out and do something good. And then he builds on that. So you add to your goodness knowledge, and then you add to your knowledge self-control, and to self-control perseverance. I love how Steve was describing perseverance last week as patient or passionate patience. And then we add to our passionate patience godliness. And so as we're talking about godliness this morning, I don't know about you, but I look at that and I have an image of somebody who is godly. And as Jen and I were talking about, we got a great interview at the end of this, by the way, but as we were talking about who we should interview, I was saying, man, I wish that we could interview my grandmother. She'd be 110 now if she was still alive. But for me, the picture of goodness is my grandmother. And I don't even know necessarily what qualities were part of that, but the very fact that when I think of godliness, I think of my grandmother. And I don't know where you go with that. If I said, so who's the godliest person you know? You know, who are you going to think of? Sue from St. Catharines, if you're listening, you just got a shout out. Marg Easton, right? And the list goes on. We have pictures of people who are godly, but then if you say, so why do you think they are godly? You might struggle to come up with the exact characteristics. And I would say that there are some perverted perspectives of godliness. Because sometimes we throw that word onto somebody who is just extremely religious. Somebody who is really judgmental. So as we go through this, it says, add to your faith godliness. And I needed to get a definition so that we had common language as we move forward. So the word that gets used for godliness, the actual definition is piety. And so it can get translated as piety or as godliness, devotion. So when I think of piety, I think judgmental. All right? And yet, as Peter is talking to us about this, he says that this is a quality that we need to add to our faith. If we are going to grow up spiritually, we need to add, piety. And when I think of piety, I think of pious, obviously, and then which I just translate to pompous, which probably isn't an accurate translation, but that's what I think. So what is Peter talking about? Well, I need to go a little bit deeper. I need to understand what the definition of piety is because, I've made my own judgments on what piety means. And piety, as a word, is reverence for God or devout fulfillment of religious obligations. And if you've studied the Bible much at all, is there a group of people that you think was devout to religious obligations? Pharisees. Exactly. That describes the Pharisees so well. And if you remember, Jesus' response to the Pharisees was, good on you for following the rules, but you don't have love. In fact, if there was a group of people that Jesus confronted more than any other group, it was the Pharisees. And he always confronted them about, really good, follow the rules, congratulations. But one thing that we need to understand is that the Pharisees were under a different covenant than we are under. And so we need, as we go forward and try to listen to what Peter is saying about piety, we need to bring it into a new covenant perspective. When we look at the difference between the old covenant and the new covenant, we need to understand that there is a shift that comes with Jesus. The old covenant was all about following the rules. The old covenant was about preserving a nation. The old covenant was centered around what? It was centered around the temple. And so the old covenant, all the obligations that they had about sacrifices were brought to the temple. All the festivals they had were brought to Jerusalem. Everything was focused on the temple and temple service and temple sacrifice. This is my own definition. The old covenant when we talk about piety, was devotion to God through religious practice. But under the new covenant, it's devotion to God through following Jesus. If you look at the difference between the two, and as we understand the difference between being Pharisees and being followers of Christ, there are some significant differences. The old covenant was systematic, and the new covenant is relational. Because what you've got to understand is Jesus came to fulfill the law. Jesus came not to abolish it, but to fulfill it. And everything he does is about fulfilling the old covenant, and everything we do is also about fulfilling. It's really interesting. So if your whole world is centered around temple worship and temple sacrifice, and Jesus comes along and does one sacrifice once and for all of a sudden the obligations of the temple are no longer there. Everything changes with Jesus. Everything changes with Jesus. And under this new covenant, we are called into piety or into godliness. But it is a different godliness than gathering around the temple and religious practice. And so, when we move forward in our discussion about godliness, we need to recognize that our call is different than that of the Pharisees. So what's it say? If you look in 2 Timothy chapter 3, this is Paul writing to Timothy. He writes this, "But mark this, there will be terrible things in the last days." And you go, terrible things, like, the world blowing up, nuclear warfare, and you start to think apocalyptic. But then, if we actually look at the list of things that Paul writes down for Timothy, he says, mark my words, these things are coming. He says, people will be lovers of themselves. Oh, glad we don't live in the last days, right? Lovers of money. Wow, how horrible that would be. Boastful, proud, abusive, disobedient to their parents, ungrateful, unholy, without love, unforgiving, slanderous, without self-control, brutal, not lovers of good. This was written like 1950 years ago. As it's writing about the last days, he's saying things will be horrible. People will be lovers of money, lovers of themselves. Sometimes we get lost in the fact that we are so off focus in our existence. If you go back to Peter's age, if you go back to Paul writing to Timothy, he says, imagine what this would be like. Well, we know what this is like, because this is our existence. Treacherous, rash, conceited, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, having a form of godliness but denying its power. Isn't it interesting that what Paul says is that not all godliness or all piety is good? When it's misdirected, it misses out on what it is to be. And then he says, have nothing to do with such people. So often as I think about where the church is at worldwide, we have come up with all kinds of theologies to simply satisfy our love for money. And Paul tells Timothy, be wary of that, be careful with that. The very fact is that that's a form of godliness. You are devoted to something. You'll come up with a system to get rich, trying to use the Bible to do it. It's a form of godliness, but it has zero power in relationship to your relationship with God. So what is godliness? I jump back to another definition or another description of the Greek word that gets translated to godliness. It says, a godly heart response naturally expresses itself in reverence for God and what God calls sacred. Worthy of veneration. There's another word I don't use a whole lot. Veneration. So I got to look it up. And this is what it says. Veneration is to have great respect or reverence for. So in this new covenant experience of piety, we are to show great respect or reverence for God and for the things God considers sacred. Under the old covenant, there was the sacred mountain. There was the temple. Under this new covenant, what is sacred? I think when I try to track this down, probably we can find a description of this. You know, if somebody had asked Jesus, so what's the greatest command of all? Maybe we could start there. Maybe that's what he considers sacred. What did he say? So the story is that there's this teacher of the law that's maybe a Pharisee, comes up to Jesus and says, so ultimately he says, so what really matters? What's the greatest commandment? And Jesus responds, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength. And then he goes, but the second is like it, or equal to it. And it's love your neighbor as yourself. And if we are under a relational covenant, then it only makes sense that the sacred things are relational. And so, in another case, in Luke chapter 10, a man comes up to Jesus and says, and this is a teacher of the law, he's very smart, and he'd probably listened to Jesus before. He says, you know, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus says to him, what does the law say? What does it say? He responded, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. And so if we are to show godliness or piety, or if we are to show great respect, Jesus in that answer describes 3 different relationships. And if we are going to be godly in our response to God's love for us, then we are going to have great respect for what he considers sacred. And in that, we are to love God, we are to love our neighbor, and what so often we miss out on is that we are to respect ourselves. And a lot of you are going, no, that's not what it says. You're going to say, Paul talks about how he beat his body into submission. Well, obviously, in that statement, he respects that his body has value in accomplishing what God had called him to. Let's track through it. If godliness reveals itself through great respect for God, how do we show our respect for God? What are the things that we're going to do? Well, probably number one, we're going to learn about, right? And Peter tracks this way as well. He says, so add to your goodness, just start with goodness, but then you better add to that goodness knowledge. You better learn about this God that you claim to serve. But it doesn't stop with just God, because we are to respect the things that God considers sacred. What do you know about your neighbor? As I think about my grandmother, she was a great neighbor. She was somebody who was invested in the people around her. She genuinely cared about those who were around her. Godliness is respecting, not just respecting, having great respect for the people who are around us. You got to learn about your neighbor. And then what about yourself? As Jesus says, love the Lord your God, love your neighbor as yourself. He doesn't exclude you. How many people came to Joy Bible Camp as kids, came to summer camp? Does anybody know the Joy Camp song? It's Joy, Joy Bible Camp. Camp of camps the best. Jesus first and others second. You last, God will bless. See, in the name of joy, joy is made up of Jesus first, others second, yourself last. It doesn't exclude you. It requires a respect for yourself. What do you know about yourself? There are so many Christ followers I know who have not taken time to investigate why they do the things they do, why they tick certain ways. What do you know about yourself? What do you know? So many followers of Christ have almost shipwrecked their faith because they get stupid angry about things that don't matter. And they destroy the relationships that God considers sacred. You can't be godly without taking time to respect yourself, without taking time to learn about yourself. What else? If we are going to have great respect for God, we are going to listen to. Now, I would have said communicate, but we're pretty easy to tell God what he should do. And we're pretty good at telling our neighbors what they should do. But are we good at listening? You know, the truth is that we are pretty judgmental, most of us. We are pretty judgmental about our neighbors. But have we ever taken time to listen to our neighbors? Have we ever taken time to communicate with our neighbors? Because part of being godly is about listening to your neighbors, giving them a chance. Maybe they do things that you would never do, but have you ever had a conversation about why they do that? Or do you just stand in judgment of them? Because godliness requires that you respect your neighbors, which means you must listen to your neighbors. It's the same with God, right? I mean, we could say we love God or we respect God, but if we refuse to do the things that we know God wants us to do, then that's just a whole bunch of hot air. Because true respect has a response and a reaction. And we actually learn about God, we actually listen to God, and we follow. But how does this translate to ourselves? How do we respect ourselves by listening to ourselves? Even in that, do we listen to what... Do you recognize that you are a miracle, the very fact that you exist? You are God's handiwork. He created the body that you wear. Do you respect the creation God has surrounded you with? Do you respect and listen to your body when it tells you need more sleep? Or when you need to deal with stress? Do you listen to what your body is saying? Another thing godliness is, it's serving and caring for. Are we serving and caring for the things of God? Are we serving and caring for our neighbors? Are we serving and caring for our physical needs? And keep in mind, this is where Paul's instruction about he beats his body into submission, because not everything your body wants is good. Simply because you want it doesn't mean you need it or should have it, says the chubby guy at the front. That's the fact, right? We need to pay attention not to just satisfying our desires and urges, but actually respecting this body that God has given us and we need to care for it, and sometimes we need to just beat it into submission. As we wrap this up, there's another area that I believe is part of godliness, and it predates even the Old Covenant. And we find this in Genesis chapter 2, verse 15. The Lord took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and take care of it. And as we look at this, there is a bit of a tension between working the land or building on the land and developing the land and taking care of it. And this is a huge conversation that all I'm going to do is throw it there and say, godliness includes caring for, having great respect for creation, not poisoning the earth, working it with great respect. And what does that look like? Well, there's a whole big conversation. But godliness includes having respect for creation. God calls us to that. He placed us on this earth for that. I've heard conversations about, you know what, this whole earth is going to be destroyed. Why are we so worried about it? The very fact is that this body of mine will be destroyed. That doesn't mean I didn't eat breakfast. That doesn't mean that I don't care for it while I'm here. And our responsibility to care for the earth while we are here, again, is all part of having respect and piety for the things that God cares about, for the creation He created. Can you imagine if you created something, whether a piece of art, a painting, or anything else, and everybody else just tore it apart, just destroyed it, didn't care about it? This is God's creation. This is God's art. We need to care about it, not poison it. I want to leave you with a verse that I think actually feeds into this whole idea that we fulfill the law through godliness. In Romans 13, verse 8, it says, "Let no debt remain outstanding except the continuing debt of love for one another, for whoever loves others has fulfilled the law." Whoever loves others has had piety or displays piety to the sacred things of God. Godliness is no longer about making sure you never miss a Sunday service. It's about revealing God to all those around you and serving the God who loves you. Being pious, showing great respect for the sacred things of God. I'm just going to call on Jen and Brendy to come up, and they're going to talk about this whole topic.
So all week I had one name in mind for this interview, and it was Brendan Landis, who represents the younger generation. And so I thought it would be great for us to just tap into where he's coming from in the topic of godliness and what his thoughts are. And so I thought, first of all, Kev had his definition, but now it's our time. So we'll first ask you, what would you say your definition of the word godliness is? Just personally, how you relate to that word.
So when you asked that question last night, I was thinking about godliness, and for myself, I think in a lot of ways, the idea of godliness is still being formed in my mind, coming from where I've come from. But just this morning, as I was sitting at the back, and I was just saying, Lord, what is this godliness? Before Kevin started speaking during the worship period. But I just felt drawn to the nature, the trees and the water, and creation, and how it just exists. And Kevin touched on the creation and the care of the creation. And I feel like a lot of that works into the whole godliness aspect. I I probably can give a better illustration I can speak better to what godliness is not,
Right.
more than what it actually is. For myself, when I was growing up, the godliness was that exact thing of going to church every Sunday and of reading the Bible every day. And evangelism wasn't very effective, but in fact, in a lot of just telling people that they're going to hell, which doesn't really work so well. But yeah, so it's still being formed, and I loved it this morning. It brought a lot of different things together for me.
Cool. And I love your attitude of still being formed, because I love that. I actually think that's part of godliness too, is that we never arrive, that we are always growing and always open to learning and being like just growing from what we're learning each day. And I think that is actually kind of a form of godliness as well, that openness to learn and grow. So you mentioned a little bit about your younger self, and that you sort of thought as a younger person that godliness looked like, what your experience was, right? So do you want to add anything to sort of your younger self's perspective and your older self's perspective?
Yeah, so growing up, it was a lot about what you do and just following what the elders said that you're supposed to do, and trying to learn the knowledge of God, and the knowledge of Christianity, which is healthy and is good, but there's more to it. And now to look at it today, it's not so much the outward expression of going to church every Sunday, but more of the intimate walk with God every day and every moment of every day.
Which is very cool and looks really different for everybody depending how we're wired, right? I was just talking to a friend this morning. I was saying, like, some of my most intimate moments with God is with people and just connecting at that level. And the next person, it might be in music, it might be through work, it might be like God connects with all of us so differently, so intimately with how we're wired. And I guess what Kev said about getting to know ourselves so that we know how we do connect intimately with the one who created us is really important. And that we don't judge others for connecting differently. Right? Because, one will look out here and be so connected, and the next will maybe even be in an urban center and connect in a different way, right?
Yeah, because if you look at the difference between church in the city versus in the country, it's very different.
Yeah. But it's still the same God, and it's still the same connection with a different flavor, maybe, right? So humanness, I think humanness always seems to get sucked into our humanness. There's some kind of safety or something that a lot of us, not all of us, find in systems and formulas, and we can define it and we can put our hands on it and we can judge you if you don't measure up. So what do you have to say to that? The systems and formulae. Why are we sucked into systems and formulas?
Well, I was in school. I was half done in studying to be an accountant. I wanted to get my CPA designation. All that is about formulas and how businesses work and all of that, which it was very attractive to me because it was a box. It was something that I could fit into. And I think we follow that same idea with God, is that we kind of want something that we can understand and we can handle and we can grasp, something that we can conquer. But with God, he's not this thing to be conquered. We can't necessarily conquer him because he is, in a lot of ways, a mystery.
That can be a little stressful for some of us.
Yeah, because he doesn't fit. He doesn't really fit.
Is the conquering more about us than God then?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Because, and I guess it's a different person. It's different from person to person. because some people want something more, like will want to conquer things, conquer the world.
All right, so as Christ followers, how do we get more of that intimate connection, if you want to call that godliness, whatever? How do we experience more of that from your perspective?
This one's fun.
Okay.
I think in a lot of life, what we surround ourselves with, we eventually become, or we become more like. In the business world, for myself, to be able to surround yourself with people in business, that's what you have to do to be able to survive, and people who are like you in the business world. But also, we can apply that to God. If we want more of God or more godliness, there's no other way that doesn't end in religion than to simply spend time with Him. Whether that's in nature and locked away in a quiet room, or even with family, like the spending time with God and inviting Him into every moment, regardless what those moments look like.
Whew. That could transform a lot of moments if we invited God into the room. That could transform a lot of moments. So, in closing, just help us grasp a little bit more of, Jesus walked this earth. He was embodied, what God was. And at that point, God was very distant and very systematic. And then Jesus comes. He embodies the characteristics. He is God. He embodies God. He then leaves His Spirit when He leaves the earth and says, I am leaving my Spirit here so that your story and my story can connect with that Spirit and become a God story, and God in us changes the world, right? So in this day and age, in the climate we're living in and all the troubles around us, what does that look like? If we truly grasp that as individuals, as Christ followers, if we truly grasp spirit-to-spirit connection and God in us, how does that transform the world around us and the craziness that we're all seeing around us?
I can get excited about that. In human perspectives, when we bring God into the picture, the impossible, or the Spirit of God into the picture, the impossible things become possible. We see that with Jesus, and in the Scripture, in different encounters that he had with different individuals. Both in the physical, like the healing, the physical healing, but also if you look at the story of the woman at the well, is more the emotional healing and the blessing of different people's journeys and stories. So, what does it actually look like to have more of God? I can't necessarily put that into a box and say that this is what it looks like, but for myself, it is more of a contentment in life and a peace, but actually it's a being at peace.
It's not doing peace?
Yeah, it's just it's a rest. It's a resting and being at peace with for yourself, but with God and the things around you, and bringing heaven to earth, in the sense of, God, what is your heart about this, and how can I influence this realm, this world, in a way? How can I bring you, God, into this situation, and what is your heart in this situation, and how can we bring change to it?
I love it. That is amazing. So it's really again not about us, but more of our surrender to that Spirit that is full of peace, love, joy, patience, all the things that we're talking about in our Become series. Thank you so much for your thoughts, for your time, and for just kind of contemplating with me and sharing with all of us your beautiful thoughts. Thanks.
Next week, I'm back there listening to Kevin And I actually started writing my message for next week, this week. And so, what's that? No. Earlier this week in my office. No, not while you were speaking. So earlier this week, I had my journal and I started writing my message for next week. Because next week, we move from godliness to where Peter says in the NIV, he says mutual affection. The New American Standard says brotherly kindness. The Message says warm friendliness. And so I started writing my message, but Kevin already said what I've written. So I've got a shorter message for next week. And everybody said. But it's amazing to me how much of this just all dovetails, right? As we look at this and we say, add to our faith, and here's the list, we cannot compartmentalize it and say, okay, I've done that, and now I'm here. I've done that, and now I'm here. We have to recognize that this all flows together. It all comes together, and be aware of each one, but recognizing that we don't compartmentalize it. And so godliness is lived out, as we've heard, it's our love for God and love for others, and that's what we're looking at next week. And this mutual affection, it's an emotion. It is this, you stop and think about right now how you felt maybe seeing some people for the first time in months. What was that emotion? It's that warm, it's that warm friendliness, that mutual affection. But it goes so much further than that. And that's what we're going to look at next week, is how does that mutual affection glorify God and serve others? How do we practically live that out?